be here with so many people talking about one of my favourite topics, sort of diversity or lack thereof in higher education. So in terms of disclosures, I'm clearly a woman, which in my current role is actually quite unusual, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm also a PI in an FP7 funded programme called Geographic, which seeks to develop gender equality action plans for higher education throughout Europe. And I'll be referring to some of the data that we've generated in Geographic over the course of this talk. So I'm going to start in 1968 with this, the Ford machinist strike that has really become a thing of myth and legend now. This was a strike that took place in 1968, and it was actually a sort of labour relations dispute in the UK, which became a landmark moment in history for gender equality. The strike began in Dagenham. There were two Ford factories in the UK at the time, one in Dagenham and one in Hale Wood in Liverpool. And the strike began on the 7th of June when women machinists in the Dagenham plant walked out, followed a few days later by their female colleagues working in the Hale Wood assembly plant. These women made car seat covers, and they were largely a very skilled workforce who had trained in a variety of different sectors before coming to the factory, but some of them had even trained, in the case of one notable worker in Paris, in haute couture, before she moved to the Ford Hale Wood plant in Liverpool. And as part of a regrading exercise, they were informed that their jobs were graded in category B, which was defined as less skilled production, instead of category C, more skilled production. And the majority of jobs in category B were women, and the majority of jobs in category C were men. And because of that, they were going to be paid 15% less than the full B rate, which their male colleagues were receiving. And it was irrespective of the skills that the skills were involved. So the women went on strike, and within 2 weeks they managed to shut down production completely across the whole of the Ford empire in the UK, because you can't push a car out of the factory line without seat covers. So following an intervention by Barbara Castle, the Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity in the Harold Wilson government, the strike ended just 3 weeks after it began, when it was agreed that the women would receive an immediate 8% pay rise, going up to category B within a few years. The reason why the strike became really important, though, is because it led to the 1970 Equal Pay Act, which got royal assent 2 years later, 2 years after the Dagenham strike, the Ford strike, on the 29th of May in 1970. Interestingly, it didn't come into force for another 5 years, and it subsequently was superseded by the 2010 Equality Act, and then the 2011 Public Sector Equality Duty, which defined 9 protected characteristics, and I'll talk about more of them in a minute. But it was the Dagenham strike that was the trigger for passing the Equal Pay Act. And for the first time in law in the UK, it basically laid down terms of pay and conditions that gave equal right to men and women in law. And there were a variety of other things that happened in the sector afterwards which led to the Equal Pay Act, but that's just the legal history. Of note, it's not well known, but the women in Dagenham and in the Hale Wood factory in Fords didn't actually get full regrading until the late 80s. So it took nearly another 2 decades before they actually got their full regrading and their full pay. And many of the instigators of the original strike had retired or even died by the time they actually formally won that. And that's not that well documented by Hollywood or on stage and screen. So how far have we come in the 40-odd years that have elapsed since then? In higher education institutes, I would argue not that far. For a variety of reasons, all of which I'll outline briefly. I think there is still a huge mountain to climb in terms of gender diversity and equality of pay in the higher education sector. Often when I give talks like this, particularly to senior management teams in universities, I'm often challenged with, well, is it actually real, or is it just a perception that you don't have equality? So we did back in Ireland, we did a national online survey, and we had over 4,800 respondents from across the higher education sector. And really we were asking about perception versus reality, what colleagues thought. Just over half thought there was gender inequality in the higher education sector in Ireland, and I'll show you some actual data in a minute, but this was about perception. So just over half of my former colleagues in Ireland thought there was gender inequality. 22% thought that there was no inequality, and 23% just didn't have an opinion, couldn't make their mind up, didn't care enough to answer that particular question. But when we look at the breakdown in gender, perhaps it will be not surprising to anyone that of the respondents, 64% of women working in higher education in Ireland perceived that there was gender inequality compared to just 38% of men. So there is a definite gender disaggregation on our perception of whether there's equality or not in the workplace in higher education in Ireland. And it is gender specific. If you break down respondents by grade, so for example, an early stage career researcher versus someone from the professoriate, there was no difference in perception. This was a very, very clear demarcation in perception around gender. And it wasn't transferred to contract type, area of work, or pay or other grade. So that's the perception. So what does the data show? And I love this quote from the American economist Edward Deming. My research group hate this quote because I say it all the time, but you can trust in God, everyone else has to bring the data. So when we look at the actual data, here are a couple of snapshots, and I won't go through these in a lot of detail, but this is all data that's available in the public domain. So this is diversity in the UK higher education sector, a snapshot of the percentage of the professoriate who are women, going back from 2000 up to 2016. And you can see, this is HESA data, you can see there's a very, very slow rate of incline, moving from about 13-14% in 2001 to about 23-24% in 2016. So a very, very slow improvement, an improvement, but a very slow rate of improvement. And if you look at that in a bit more granular detail, you can see there's very little geographic variation across the United Kingdom. Devolution has had absolutely no effect on that at all, but interestingly, given the audience today, you might just pick out the fact that Wales does seem to be a tiny bit of an outlier in that the data is worse for Wales than the other devolved nations. What about Ireland? So as Catherine said, I've spent the last 12-13 years working in Ireland. We often benchmark in the Irish sector to what's happening in the UK. UK tends to set the pace and Ireland tends to lag behind. And this is diversity in the Irish higher education ecosystem. This is the percentage of male and female academic staff in all Irish universities, and it's a 3-year average. This is data from 2013 to 2015. We do have the 2015-2018 data just, and depressingly, it's not massively different. But you can see that there is quite a marked disparity in the professoriate. 81% of the professoriate is male, just 19% of the professoriate is female in Ireland. But what you can see here, quite interestingly, is the academic journey from undergrad through to professoriate, the sort of cradle to chair journey. And you can see that the switch takes place at tenure at the lecturer level. So in line with the rest of Europe, the majority, just the slight majority of our undergraduates coming into higher education in Ireland are female. But it's not so much a leaky pipe as a hemorrhaging pipe when we get to the lecturer grade. Women, for whatever reason, really struggle to progress beyond lecturer in the higher education system in Ireland. I don't know how we address the fact that 50% of our lecturers are women, but only 19% of them progress to the professoriate. And this isn't new data. That data has been fairly consistent for the last 15 to 20 years now. And we were just saying on the front row, one of my best examples, one of my throwaway comments is that since the first Irish university was established some 425 years ago now, there's never been a female president ever in an Irish university. And in fact, the School of Medicine in my former college, University College Cork, one of the NUI colleges, appointed its first female professor ever in 2009. And that was on a retention case when she was headhunted by another university in a different country. And I know that because it was me. And I remained the only female professor on staff in the College of Medicine at UCC. till 2014, when I put up a retention case to retain my colleague, Professor Geraldine Boylan, who became the second full female professor and is now the only full female professor because I left. So things haven't really progressed as rapidly as we would like to think. I'm also going to talk very briefly about gender pay gap and how these coalesce shortly, but this is a topic that's been getting a huge amount of attention recently, both in the UK and elsewhere, probably reflecting the regulations which came into force in 2017 around public disclosure of gender pay gap. So the Gender Pay Gap Information Regulations became active, as it were, in 2017. And essentially what they mean is that there is a legal responsibility, a legal requirement for all public, private and voluntary sector organisations with more than 250 employees on their headcount, on their payroll, to publish their gender pay gap data. And compliance has been patchy, I think it's fair to say. But when this progresses, in another year or so, there'll be significant financial penalties for not publishing the data. This is the amazing Keri Gracie. Many of you will know her. She was a foreign correspondent for the BBC. She mainly did the Asia office, had a really significant workload covering a huge geographical part of the world. And she was disgusted when she found out that she was being paid less than her male colleagues, many of whom carried responsibility for smaller geographical areas in the overseas foreign correspondent office in the BBC. Keri Gracie really was the poster girl for what subsequently happened at the BBC. And you'll all be familiar that with the BBC publishing their top earners year on year now for the last couple of years, and men still dominate the star salaries. And you can see the gender pay gap on the left of this chart here, showing that the more someone earns, the more likely they are to be male within the BBC. BBC have also done a whole heap of amazingly conniving things to make their gender pay gap data better by setting up subsidiaries and offshoring a lot of their former female staff into companies that have 249 staff members, one headcount below the legal limit for actually publishing your gender pay gap data, and a whole heap of other really quite nasty stuff. If you're interested, you can go on the website, www.genderpaygapservice.gov.uk, and this is actually quite a user-friendly interface, and you can pull up your own organisation's gender pay gap data, assuming that they have actually submitted it, and this is ours. This is the gender pay gap in the University of Liverpool, and you can see that we have a significant problem with gender pay gap. In the top quartile, the highest paid of my University of Liverpool colleagues, you can see that the gender pay gap is very high. In this representation here, we've got the numbers of women in the highest quartile in receipt of those salaries, and it's only 38%. Overwhelmingly, the majority of my colleagues in the highest quartile for pay are male. And similarly, if you look at the lowest quartile, over 70% of people in the lowest quartile for pay in the University of Liverpool are female. There are a couple of things driving this, and one of them is bonus pay. So we've looked at this in quite a bit of detail, and of those who receive bonus pay in the University of Liverpool, 1.3% of them are women and 2% are men. But the difference is massive in what they actually earn. Women's mean bonus pay is astonishingly 76% lower than men's, and the median bonus pay is 90% lower than men's. And we've unpacked this because this data is really worrying, and it actually led to us being name-checked in the House of Commons as one of the worst public sector organisations with the biggest gender pay gap. And there are two reasons why our data is so bad. Firstly, almost all, 95% of the gender pay gap at the top end of the spectrum is driven by clinical excellence awards. So these are awards given to my clinical colleagues by the NHS, and they're largely given to very senior clinicians, clinical academics working in the NHS. We have no control over who gets them. So the NHS tell us who to give a clinical excellence awards to, and the university simply have to pay it. And it might surprise nobody to know that most of the recipients of the biggest awards are males. In fact, we have no female clinical academics on gold or platinum awards, which is it's definitely our problem. It may not be our fault, but it is definitely our problem, because for whatever reason, our female clinical academics do not apply for or do not receive clinical academic excellence awards. And at the bottom end of the spectrum, the University of Liverpool have, unlike a lot of universities in the sector, not outsourced our domestic services. So we still have all our own cleaning staff, on our staff. Our Vice-Chancellor passionately believes that this is the right thing to do because, quite frankly, we offer better terms and conditions in terms of employment than private companies that we could offshore that to. But consequently, we carry the gender pay gap because 80 to 90% of our domestic staff are female. Other universities have massaged the figures by actually outsourcing domestic services like cleaning. So it's not just about the top line, the headline figure. This data does require a lot more in the way of a more granular investigation. Nevertheless, the sector has a problem, so much so that it's led some institutes to do some quite astonishing things. So you may remember a couple of years ago, the University of Essex looked at their pay gap, realised it was quite significant, and overnight just decided to hike the salaries for all their female professors to the average male professorial pay, which for some females in the University of Essex meant an overnight 11% pay rise. This was met with incredulity in the sector, I think it's fair to say. Larger universities were aghast because in the current fiscal climate that would be quite challenging. Unfortunately, what it's led several universities to do, and I won't name and shame them, but they've also eliminated their pay gap by paying their male professors less. They've just taken down their professorial pay to the average female, and that's been met with a huge amount of resistance. And there are at least 2 universities in the Russell Group currently in the courts fighting pretty expensive court cases for doing that. I'm actually convinced that by the time they exit the legal process, they should have just paid the difference, because what they think they're going to save, they'll just spend on barristers. So anyway. Gender pay gap in Ireland is as bad. So you can see here, this is another way of looking at it, but you can see how in Ireland the pay gap increases remarkably in terms of gender disaggregation once you get into the professoriate, particularly in those band 1 professors who are at the top of the pay scale. They're nearly all men in the Irish system, which drives the huge disparity in gender pay, in the gender pay gap in the north of €100,000 a year awards. So Ireland is almost identical to the UK. So that's just a little bit about gender pay, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the whole diversity of gender, I'm sure many people will have been challenged in a similar way, but on numerous occasions at presentations like this, there's always been one brave soul who said, well, does diversity really matter? Does it actually matter that much? What bad things have ever happened because of a lack of diversity in higher education? And I can see some people smiling, but people have actually said that. That's why I say they're quite brave souls to say that in a public meeting like this. But you know, that provocation, I think, is relatively fair in a meeting like this. I think it's relatively fair to make that provocation. And in response to that, I think I would say that, well, leaving aside the fact that gender equality is just the right thing to do, it is morally and ethically the right thing to do, it's fair and it's just. If we just leave that aside, it's also the right thing to do for very practical, very performance-related reasons. It has been shown in the private sector that if you achieve gender balance on boards, then there is a positive correlation with increased performance. All male boards of companies, or companies with all male boards, have decreased performance even when you account for all the confounders compared to those companies with more balanced, gender diverse boards. And in academia, it's been shown that research publications from diverse teams are more likely to be highly cited and more likely to land in higher impact journals than research from more homogenous teams. And the reason for that is possibly because if you have a diverse team, you avoid the sort of groupthink mentality that you can get with a more homogenous team. And that the chance of that happening, sort of groupthink, particularly down an erroneous pathway of thought, is almost certainly reduced by diversity and by gender balance. And because of this, as far back as nearly 2 decades ago now, 2001, the European Commission actually did a very detailed exercise looking at the evidence base for diversity and performance, and concluded that underrepresentation of women in scientific teams actually threatens the goals of achieving excellence, as well as being wasteful and unjust. And so consequently, it's become a prerequisite for funding in a lot of European Commission calls, and latterly it's also become a prerequisite for funding in NIHR. But I'm going to just show this video, hopefully this will work. One of the oldest examples of diversity and why diversity matters is the crash test dummy. So before seatbelts were made legal, a whole bunch of engineers working in the car industry set about designing better seatbelts using crash test dummies. And the crash test dummies they used were polyurethane, 70 kilo, 5'9" male-shaped crash test dummies. They were used repeatedly in testing of various seatbelt designs and eventually were thought to be fit for market, and in lots of tests had shown that the use of seatbelts would reduce significant morbidity and mortality in head-on collisions by X. And they were introduced without further testing to the car industry, and a few years later data emerged showing that whilst morbidity and mortality for male drivers in cars had decreased exponentially since the introduction of seatbelts, women were actually being killed more frequently, even despite the fact that they were wearing seatbelts. And that's because the crash test dummies were designed for a 70 kilo, 5'9" man. And when you put a 5'3", 55 kilo woman into that same seatbelt design, it garroted her. And women were actually dying of decapitation by seatbelt in car accidents. A very graphic and particularly poignant example of why diversity in engineering teams matters enormously. So you'd think that we wouldn't make the mistake that we made back in the 60s.
All right.
Or would you?
Watch this. Black hand, nothing. Larry, go. Black hand, nothing. Larry, go. Racist.
I had to edit it there because there's a bit of a profanity. But this went viral on the internet about 18 months ago. So this is a very large American company who make a variety of equipment for the healthcare sector, and they spend an obscene amount of money making what they thought was a very efficient no-touch soap dispenser for the American market that would actually get around a lot of market concerns at the moment about contamination in bathrooms and AMR and hygiene. It was an all-white male team from MIT who actually flogged this idea to the company, who bought the IP and scaled it up, and they spent millions and millions and millions of dollars. And it was only in post-market surveillance when black people realised they couldn't get any soap out of this thing that they realised the infrared design they'd used didn't get reflected back by black skin. So you had a classic group of how a company had developed a racist soap dispenser. A PR nightmare for them, but also incredibly expensive and just stupid to actually compile a team of human beings in the 21st century that were all white and all male led to this, and almost the ruination of the company. And unfortunately, it's not the only example. There are others. Let's go click to the next slide now, if I can.
All right.
So, I would argue that diversity does absolutely matter. It is diverse, it is the right thing, diversity is the right thing to do, but if that doesn't illustrate how important diversity in research and education is, then nothing will. What are the reasons for a lack of diversity at senior levels in the higher education sector? Then this is something that really, really does keep me awake at night. The sort of debates that I engage with my senior colleagues as to the reasons why we are not as diverse as we should be. And these are some of the reasons that have been sort of thrown back at me for why we don't have diversity. That it's just a moment in time, that it's just history, and there just weren't enough women in the pipeline back when I went to medical school, and if I'm just patient and I stop rabbiting on about this, eventually women in the career pipeline will filter through and we'll get equality and diversity at a senior level. And then these are the ones, but I'll unpack these one by one. We've also been told that women in the pipeline are not ambitious enough, that women in the pipeline just aren't as good as men, or men are intrinsically better than women, and you would be surprised as to how many senior colleagues in higher education actually genuinely do believe that. Or it might be possible that the structures we use to assess merit and performance are not fit for purpose. So let's have a look at those reasons in detail. So, not enough women in the pipeline. Well, that I don't think is the case. I went to medical school in 1988, and even back in 1988, 40% of my intake of my year were female. And I can tell you, because we've just had our 25th year reunion, that only a tiny fraction of that 40% intake remained in hospital medicine. Those that did stay in medicine largely drifted off to community disciplines or GP, which has been the traditional gender disaggregation or gender split in medicine. So I personally don't buy from my own experience that it's just a question of time and that we just need to wait for women to reach the higher echelons. I think if that was the case, it would have happened a long time ago. But if you look in other countries where we've got much more robust data like Sweden, as far back as 1978, 68% of graduates in Sweden were female. And 32 years later, when you'd expect those graduates to be at the absolute pinnacle of their academic career, only 17% of the positions on executive committees in higher education institutes in Sweden are actually occupied by women. So if you go around the Karolinska Executive Board looks pretty much like the board of most of the universities that I've ever worked in. Only 23% of the professoriate in Sweden are female. So Sweden is a very good example of how it's not just a question of time. And in fact, if we just wait for the natural progression, if you remember that slowly inclining slide that I showed, the slow inclination on the first slide, it'll actually be 2050 before women are represented in the professoriate at the same proportion as they currently are in non-professorial academic grades below lecturer. So it won't happen in my lifetime. And I think it's a falsehood to say it's just about time. It won't be achieved in our lifetime unless, if we wait for change to occur naturally, we have to do something that's disruptive. Second reason, that women are not ambitious enough, and that that motherhood and other life choices that women face and don't ultimately are incompatible with a challenging and successful career in academia. I think that's just blatantly not true. I think women are as ambitious as men to reach the top, but they are significantly less confident than men that they'll actually get there. Ambition isn't the result of a biological difference between the sexes, but mainly, I think, a result of external factors that reduce a woman's confidence in the system to fulfill her ambition. And there's all this whole myth that's grown up around motherhood, the belief that motherhood can't be combined with a demanding scientific career. It actually has absolutely no scientific basis whatsoever. But also more frustratingly, we don't have a fatherhood myth. No one has ever asked my husband when he's turned up for a job interview, who's minding the boys? I have been asked that in more interviews than I can care to remember. And if I turn up at a conference in the States, one of the first questions even my own girlfriends will ask me is, who's got the kids? Is Matt, as my husband, is Matt babysitting the kids? My normal response to that is, no, he's parenting our children. You don't babysit your own children. But that's a whole perception around parenthood that I think and that's a wider discussion for society as a whole that I don't think we've got quite right yet. Oh, my favourite reason, that women are just not as good as men. And I do love it when someone tries to insinuate this in one way or another. The theory is that as progression is clearly based on merit, we're academics, we like a good meritocracy, and we've had a meritocracy on paper, if not in reality, then clearly women just can't be as good as men if we're not making it up the grade, and that men must be intrinsically better. I mean, I don't know where to start with this, but the ability of women, I hope, is not in question. What I do think is massively in question is the mechanisms used to assess performance, given everything else we've just discussed. I think the mechanisms that we use to assess performance are gendered and do result in significant disadvantage for women. And there's been a whole heap of data now showing that if you take a very crude outcome measure or a very crude metric of academic performance, such as outputs, publications, if you actually take into account women's period of leave, such as maternity leave, women researchers are as productive as male researchers, if not more. Because actually many of you who've been on maternity leave will know it's not like you leave the campus and stop writing. Most of us do carry on working even when we're on maternity leave. When you take that all into account, we are as productive by any crude metric that you wish to use. So there's a whole evidence base there, not that I hope we'd need one, that women are as good as men. So the fourth reason, and I think where I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my talk focused on, the structures for promotion are flawed and result in a failure to retain and promote the best talent. So in the time that I've been in higher education and academia, there have been a whole heap of initiatives aimed at improving gender balance, well-intended, good initiatives, all aimed at fixing the reasons 1 to 3. And they've largely adopted a let's fix the women approach. get more women into the pipeline, encourage the development of leadership skills and fostering networking skills, things that were historically thought not to be very good at, go to confidence workshops, all these kind of things. And I've certainly been at this, sort of at workshops, thinking about this problem and working on initiatives to fix the women for the best part of 20 years now. And it hasn't worked. So if it hasn't worked, then I think the provocation is that maybe there's nothing wrong with the women in the first place. We're not actually broken. What's actually broken is the system that we work in. And the career and assessment structures are not fit for purpose. There is endemic unconscious bias and organisational and cultural failure to recognise that. And I don't want to dismiss these programmes because they're very good. And if anyone hasn't done any of them, I would warmly recommend all of them. I've been responsible for introducing many of them to universities where I've worked, and I've enjoyed them massively and have benefited from them enormously. The problem is, I just don't think they've worked, or they certainly haven't worked to the degree that we had hoped they would. Things like the Aurora programme, Through the Glass Ceiling, Women for the Board, which is a sort of non-academic variant of these programmes trying to get women onto boards as non-execs and Mind the Gap. So, at this stage in my career, I'm now convinced that women don't need fixing, but the system definitely does. And it's all around recruitment, retention and promotion. I love this little throwaway, but it's absolutely true. There are more CEOs of large companies named David than there are CEOs who are women. And David isn't even the most common name on the boards, that's John. It was true in 2016 and it's still true in 2019. So what is it about recruitment? And I'm just going to show this now because again this is another...
Doctor? Yes. I'm terribly sorry, we haven't been told. We haven't been told you were a doctor. Oh, how do you do, Doctor? Very nice to have you with us, Doctor. Thank you.
You're in room 5, Doctor.
And Mrs. Abbott, how do you do? Dr. Abbott, actually. Sorry? Dr. Abbott.
2 doctors.
You're 2 doctors?
Yes.
Well, how did you become 2 doctors? Did you take the exam twice? My wife's a doctor.
I'm a doctor.
You're a doctor too? So you're 3 doctors? No, I'm a doctor. I'm just 1 doctor. My wife's a doctor.
Manuel, your room is at the top of the stairs along to the bed.
Oh, I see. I thought you said 2 doctors. But,
Manuel, would you take the doctor's cases up to number 5, please?
yes, this way, please, doctors. Yes.
So, the one and only Basil Fawlty illustrating unconscious bias. So we've put a lot of thought into this, and there is a huge amount of evidence that unconscious bias is a very critical part of why we are where we are. And we've taken part in research, including a variant of this paper that was published, I think in PNAS a couple of years ago. So in this paper, there were 2 identical CVs, completely identical, exactly the same education, performance, previous career history, everything, except that one was Janet and one was John. There were 2 very gendered names on the CV. And they were shared with faculty staff of both genders in all stages of their career in an appropriately statistically powered sample. And uniformly, the CV with the male name was ranked significantly higher by males and females alike. And at every career stage, showing that we all have unconscious bias, regardless of our own gender, our own background, and our own experience. And this experiment's been repeated quite a few times. We repeated a variant of it in Genovate, and we found exactly the same, that even our very well-educated, very hyper-aware, woke colleagues all had an element of unconscious bias, and it's so unconscious that no one knew they had it, which is one of the real problems. And it has massively deep roots. So again, this paper, which is fascinating reading, it's in Science, took a bunch of preschool children aged 3, and in this experiment, these mixed gender children were told about a character who was funny, bright, clever, and brave. And they all largely described that character. All the little girls said, that is a little girl, and all the boys said, it's a little boy. They all self-identified with funny, bright, clever, and brave. They repeated the experiment about a year after they'd entered primary school, after 1 year of mainstream education. And after a year of mainstream education, all the boys said that a funny, bright, clever character was male, and most of the girls said a funny, bright, clever character was male too. So within that 1 year, the girls had gone from thinking that they could be funny, bright and clever to now identifying those descriptors with male. It's got really, really deep roots, and anything we do in higher education, I think, is really cosmetic unless we address the root cause. There are some things that we can do, like one of the things that I am very concerned about with unconscious bias on recruitment panels is the Smurfette Principle. Selection panels have absolutely been shown time after time to write candidates who are in the minority, i.e. the only man in a group or the only woman in a group, as less suited to a position. That's just because they stand out and therefore they're different and therefore they get ranked inappropriately. And it unfairly disadvantages them in a recruitment process. But it is very unusual in higher education to find recruitment panels that are largely all female with just one male candidate and vice versa. It is constantly the reverse, that it's nearly always females that are in the minority, and that's why I think we are constantly disadvantaged in recruitment. So to go back to my first slide and to just reflect on the retention and promotion issue, I don't think we are held back because of a glass ceiling. It's not that we're not getting to the glass ceiling. I think we stop progressing way before we get to the ceiling. It's almost like we're throwing ourselves out of the windows on the way up. Back here at the lecturer grade, certainly in Ireland, and certainly in the UK, there's a whole cumulative effect of a number of micro issues that women face day after day, which makes them disengage with the system and leave academia. Or if they stay in academia, they certainly park their ambitions. And I won't go through all of these because I know we're tight on time, but there are a whole heap of stuff that universities do without any ill or misinformed intent. It's genuinely not mendacious, like in a lot of cases, but I think it's just the way things are set up. So, for example, if a higher education institute like Liverpool holds one annual promotion round, as they do, it's discriminatory to women, because women are much more likely statistically to miss out on an annual opportunity because of maternity leave. They're much more likely to miss that opportunity. In fact, 3 to 4 times more likely to miss that opportunity depending on the number of maternity leaves a woman takes, because of the time out and then the time needed to reintegrate after returning from leave. So we're looking now as to whether we can open a continuous year in, year out, all year round promotion round. And it's difficult and it's challenging, but just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because we've identified that for certain as a barrier to retention and promotion. And there are others, things around flexible working arrangements, family leave, and perception, real or otherwise, of other barriers. So, some solutions. First off, data. As I said before, you can trust in God, but everyone else needs the data, and it's really important that everyone has transparency of data. In the Geographic programme in Ireland, we spent 3 years trying to get data out of the higher education system. Our colleagues were very, very suspicious about our intent. I think they thought we were going to go to the tabloids with this data. And we now know that, transparency of data is essential for things like Athena Swan, which I won't talk about in any detail, but data is key. And it's not just about having the data, it's about publishing it and owning it. Our Vice-Chancellor, Janet Beer, is very well known for her work in equality and diversity. And when our gender pay gap data became apparent, she said, great, we're going to publish it. We're going to publish it on International Women's Day, and we are going to own this data. We can't deny it. It is our problem. It may not be our fault, because we aspire to good T's and C's for our domestic staff, and we don't give out the Clinical Excellence Awards, but it is now our problem, and we can't deny that. And I think that very open acknowledgement of getting the data, publishing the data, owning it and responding to it is absolutely the way forward. And then we need to make data and not gender-driven decisions. So all databases that include information on personnel should be disaggregated by gender. As soon as you blind people to gender, better decisions are made, or certainly more fair and equal decisions. But we also need to know that our systems are working, so it's important that we collect data on applicants, shortlists, appointments, recruitment panels, all these kind of things, and review it regularly. Review and monitor gender pay gap at all grades. And it's also important to collect qualitative data. In the 4 universities I've worked for, I've never had an exit interview. I would have loved one, because I would have loved to tell all the universities what worked and what didn't for someone who'd been with them for many years. But I think the qualitative piece around exit interviews, particularly for high-profile female staff who are leaving, is a lost opportunity in the sector. This is a very recent experiment from Ireland. I'm just going to finish with some positive notes. This was the result of the Irish Research Council actually gender blinding their entire grant award system in 2014. So they made the entire review process gender blind. They took off the front page, the review panels, the independent reviewers, the peer reviewers, and the panels were ignorant as to the gender of the applicants. Before they made the process gender blind, 34% of the awardees were female, and after they introduced gender blinding, 43% of the applicants were female. So just one simple thing, gender blinding and equality improved massively. It's risen significantly year on year ever since, and we're now close to something that approximates to equality in Irish Research Council funding. Sadly, not a lot of other grants, other funding agencies have done this, and any of you who follow me on Twitter will know I'm currently running a campaign against Science Foundation Ireland, who unfortunately have not done this. And because the way they have set up their funding programmes of late, which is very translational and industry focused, we suspect that the data from SFI has gotten worse rather than better in recent years. And this is the cumulative amount of funding given by the main research council in Ireland by gender. And you can see that it has increased a little bit amongst female applicants from 2003, since Science Foundation Ireland was created, up to last year, but it's increased exponentially for men. And I say that as the only female director of an SFI research centre. Myself and Geraldine were the founding directors of Infant, and we were the only female directors. Geraldine now, once again, is the only female director of an SFI research centre left in that ecosystem. And all we're asking for at the moment is for SFI to publish their data. Unfortunately, they have so far refused. We've got several freedom of information requests in. You can see this is a similar graph of the funding by gender by centre, and you can see that in every single case, male applicants or male grant awardees outstrip females massively. This is my former centre here in the middle, the only one that's got anything like equality. And one of my favourite tweets of last year, this was the launch of a new centre in Ireland. It's a centre that is based in food security with dairy technology, and these are the founding directors of the centre and Science Foundation Ireland's director. I don't know if you can see this, it's projected at the back, but this is a cake. They're cutting a cake to celebrate the launch of the centre, and there's a cow on the cake. It's a dairy centre. So I actually tweeted, a new SFI research centre is always good news, but in the month when core funding has been disaggregated from the female centre, the only woman in this photo is the cow on the cake. And I got so many aggressive emails from these gentlemen in question, including this man, who, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll know we went into a long and healthy, robust debate. He told me that he wasn't sexist, he had a very nice wife. And anything he'd achieved in his significant career, and then he told me about some of those achievements, was only made possible because of his lovely wife who stayed at home and minded the kids. So, as you can imagine, that was a debate that has gone on and on. So, key learning points: gender-neutral language, transparency, compulsory training, gender balance panels. All of these things are really important, but I'm going to close with a provocation around quotas. I believe in quotas. I think they're the right thing to do. I know that can sometimes set whole rooms like this on fire as we talk about quotas versus meritocracies. But if it's good enough for the Canadian Cabinet, I think it's good enough for academia. When the new Prime Minister of Canada was putting together his cabinet, he said very simply, I want a cabinet that looks like Canada. I want my cabinet to look like the population that it's serving. And it does. It's gender balanced. It's got ethnic representation from all the groups in Canada. It looks right. It feels right. And in the world of international politics at the moment, and I know that's a very, very low baseline, you could argue that Canada is punching above its weight. Quotas do not compromise our meritocracy. And there is a huge amount of data to support this. Quotas are not about promoting unqualified people. They actually just ensure that there are enough qualified people of both genders at every level. In the political sphere, where this has been running for quite a while, they have a zipper system where parties propose alternative male and female candidates in that order. So you end up with a 50% pool of candidates to choose from. And the zipper system has been shown to increase the overall quality of the pool. Those pools where female representation has increased the most also improve the calibre of male colleagues, because all you do by introducing a quota is encourage highly qualified women who are well able for the job, whilst discouraging mediocre men who might not be. So I don't think quotas are anything to be afraid of. It's incredibly provocative, quite controversial, but after 20 years of working in higher education, I think it's time we gave it a go. I'm going to finish by just reminding everyone in the room that everyone's an advocate in this area, and there are a huge number of things on a huge number of groups on social media and elsewhere, that even if you've only got time, if you're writing up your PhD or your postdoc and really busy and you've got zero time in the day, there are a number of things you can follow on Twitter just to raise awareness. Manelwatch is a hilarious Twitter account run by some colleagues of mine, and they basically tweet pictures of Manels, all male panels, and they embarrass them. But it's very funny and it's done a bit tongue-in-cheek and it's quite humorous. Everyday Sexism, a great Twitter account. If you ever want to laugh out loud at some of the things that Everyday Sexism tweet, it's very funny, but it does create solidarity and support. And also the He for She movement, which is a fantastic movement. It's a solidarity movement for gender equality. So thank you very much for inviting me.